Picture this. September 12th, 1683. You're standing on Kallenberg Mountain overlooking Vienna. Below you, 90,000 Ottoman soldiers surround a dying city. For 2 months, they've been digging tunnels beneath the walls, packing them with gunpowder, blowing gaps in the defenses. Inside, 15,000 defenders are starving. Dysentery ravages the garrison. The civilians are eating rats. The walls have been breached in multiple places. Kara Mustafa Pasha, the Ottoman Grand Vizier, has promised his soldiers 3 days of unrestricted plunder once the city falls. According to Ottoman military tradition, any city that resists will be sacked, men killed, women enslaved, children sold. Vienna has maybe 3 days left, maybe less. Then you hear it, a rumble that grows into thunder. You turn and see them, 18,000 cavalry forming up along the ridge line. Polish Winged Hussars with their distinctive feathered backs. German cuirassiers in blackened armor. Austrian cavalry regiments. At their head rides Jan III Sobieski, King of Poland, who's marched his army 200 miles in 2 weeks to get here. The cavalry begins moving downhill. Slowly at first, then faster. The ground shakes. The Ottomans, who've been focused on the siege for 60 days, suddenly realize they're about to be hit from behind by the largest cavalry charge in history. Their camp, loaded with 2 months of plunder and supplies, lies directly in the path. They have minutes to react. This isn't a story about religious destiny. This is a story about logistics, desperation, and one catastrophic military miscalculation that ended 300 years of Ottoman expansion into Europe. The Siege of Vienna in 1683 represents one of the most decisive Christian victories over Muslim forces in European history. For casual observers, it's often remembered as a simple tale. The heroic Winged Hussars rode to the rescue and saved Christianity. That version is wrong, or at least it's incomplete. The reality is far more complex and far more instructive about how wars are actually won and lost. This wasn't a battle between good and evil. It was a clash between 2 sophisticated military powers, both fielding professional armies, both using cutting-edge siege technology, both making calculated strategic decisions. One side made better tactical choices on September 12th. The other side paid for its mistakes with 15,000 dead, an empire's momentum shattered, and a Grand Vizier strangled with a silk cord 3 months later. Here's what most people get wrong. They think Vienna was saved by cavalry heroism alone. They miss the 2 months of grinding siege warfare that preceded the final battle. They don't understand that the Ottomans came within days, possibly hours, of taking the city through systematic mining operations that would have rendered the walls irrelevant. They don't grasp that Kara Mustafa Pasha was not an incompetent commander, but rather a skilled general who'd conquered multiple fortresses and who made one fatal error. He became so fixated on capturing Vienna that he failed to adequately guard against a relief force he knew was coming. And here's the uncomfortable truth that gets glossed over. Both sides committed atrocities. Both sides saw this as an existential conflict. The Ottomans promised their soldiers the traditional 3 days of sack and plunder. The Christian forces, when they finally entered the Ottoman camp, gave no quarter to the thousands of Christian slaves they found chained there, not because they were cruel, but because in the chaos of a collapsing army, there was no infrastructure to manage prisoners or freed captives. This is medieval warfare, not a fairy tale. The stakes in 1683 were genuinely enormous. The Ottoman Empire had been expanding into Europe for 300 years. They'd taken Constantinople in 1453. They'd pushed into Hungary, Croatia, and the Balkans. They'd besieged Vienna once before in 1529 under Suleiman the Magnificent. Now, under Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, they were trying again. If Vienna fell, the roads to the German states would be open. The Holy Roman Empire would be crippled. The balance of power in Europe would fundamentally shift, so when 18,000 horsemen charged down Kallenberg Mountain on that September afternoon, they weren't just relieving a siege, they were deciding whether the Ottoman Empire would control Central Europe. This is that story, not the myth, the actual war. To understand why 90,000 Ottoman soldiers surrounded Vienna in July 1683, you have to go back decades and understand the internal politics of both empires. The Ottoman Empire under Sultan Mehmed V was not in decline. This is crucial. Western historiography loves to portray the Ottomans in 1683 as a dying empire. They weren't. They were a sophisticated state with professional standing armies, advanced artillery engineering corps that could conduct siege warfare better than most European powers, and an administrative system that had functioned for centuries. Their problem wasn't weakness. Their problem was that they had enemies on multiple fronts, internal political factions, and an overly ambitious Grand Vizier. Kara Mustafa Pasha, his name means Black Mustafa, became Grand Vizier in 1676. He was not a reckless warmonger. He was a calculated politician who understood that military success was his path to securing power and wealth. He'd successfully put down rebellions. He'd captured fortresses in Ukraine. He knew how to conduct siege warfare. But he also had enemies at court who wanted his position, which meant he needed a spectacular victory to cement his status. Vienna was that target. The Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I ruled from Vienna. His empire was a patchwork of German states, Austrian territories, and Hungarian lands that were constantly threatened by Ottoman incursions. Leopold had been paying tribute, essentially protection money, to the Ottomans for years. His military was overstretched. He'd been fighting wars against France. His treasury was depleted. When intelligence reports arrived in early 1683, indicating that the Ottomans were preparing a major campaign, Leopold faced a nightmare scenario. Vienna might actually be indefensible. The catalyst came from Hungarian politics. A group of Hungarian nobles led by Imre Tokoli had rebelled against Habsburg rule and allied with the Ottomans. This gave Kara Mustafa both a pretext for war and a strategic ally that could provide supplies and local knowledge. By spring 1683, Ottoman forces were assembling. The target wasn't publicly declared, but everyone knew: Vienna. Leopold made a critical decision. In early July, as the Ottoman army approached, he evacuated Vienna with his court and fled to Passau. This wasn't cowardice, it was pragmatic. If the emperor was captured, the war was over. But it meant that Vienna's defense would fall to Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, the military commander of the garrison, with about 15,000 soldiers, 11,000 regular troops, plus 4,000 militia and armed citizens, against an army that would eventually number between 90,000 and possibly 170,000 when you count support troops and allied forces. The math didn't look good. On July 14, 1683, Ottoman forces arrived outside Vienna's walls. Kara Mustafa sent the traditional surrender demand. Starhemberg refused. The siege began. Medieval siege warfare is not what most people imagine. It's not dramatic walls, scaling and heroic sword fights. It's engineering. It's math. It's grinding, methodical work that takes weeks or months. The Ottomans in 1683 were masters of this craft. Here's how it worked. First, you surround the target and cut off all supply lines. No food gets in, no reinforcements, no communication except what you allow. Vienna was built on the Danube River, which meant one side was protected by water. But the Ottoman forces stretched their siege lines in a massive arc around the rest of the city, digging trenches, building earthworks, positioning artillery. Then you start digging. The Ottomans brought thousands of sappers, military engineers, whose job was to dig tunnels under the walls, not to get inside. To pack the tunnels with gunpowder and blow gaps in the fortifications. This is called mining. The defenders would try to dig counter-mines, tunnels to intercept the attackers' tunnels, and you'd have underground battles in cramped, dark spaces where men killed each other with shovels and knives because guns were too dangerous around all that gunpowder. Vienna's walls were substantial but outdated. They'd been built in the 16th century and upgraded over the decades, but they weren't state-of-the-art star-fort designs. The Ottomans identified weak points and concentrated their mining efforts there. By late July, the first mines began detonating. Each explosion killed defenders, created rubble that could be used as a ramp, and weakened the structural integrity of adjacent wall sections. Inside the city, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Starhemberg had stockpiled some food, but not enough for a siege that would last 2 months. Rationing began immediately. The garrison was reduced to bread, beans, and whatever horses could be slaughtered. Civilians fared worse. Water became contaminated. Dysentery spread. The wounded from daily skirmishes and mine explosions filled makeshift hospitals where physicians had insufficient supplies. Morale was maintained through a combination of discipline, religious faith, and the knowledge of what would happen if the city fell. Ottoman military tradition held that a city that surrendered quickly would be treated leniently, lives spared, property respected, ransom paid. But a city that resisted, that forced the attackers to take casualties, would be given over to the soldiers for 3 days of unrestricted sack. Everything would be plunder. Rape was expected, survivors would be enslaved. Vienna's garrison knew this, so they fought. The Ottomans, meanwhile, were dealing with their own logistical challenges. An army of 90,000 plus requires enormous amounts of food, water, fodder for horses, gunpowder, ammunition. Supply lines stretched back through Hungary. Kara Mustafa had brought a massive baggage train, hundreds of carts loaded with supplies, siege equipment, and the Grand Vizier's personal effects, which reportedly included silks, jewels, and furnishings for a palace he intended to occupy in Vienna after its capture. This is important. Kara Mustafa was not expecting a quick victory. He knew Vienna would take weeks to reduce. What he didn't adequately prepare for was a major relief force arriving before the city fell. By mid-August, Vienna was breaking. The Ottoman mining operations had created multiple breaches. On August 12, a particularly large mine detonated beneath the Lowell bastion, collapsing a section of wall and killing dozens of defenders. Ottoman forces attempted to storm through the gap. Starhemberg committed his reserves to plug the breach. Vicious hand-to-hand fighting ensued in the rubble. The Ottomans were pushed back, but only barely. The defenders rebuilt the breach with earth, timber, whatever materials they could find. It wouldn't hold against another major explosion. Sources disagree on exact casualty figures, but by late August, Vienna's garrison had lost approximately 2,000 to 3,000 men, about 20% of their effective fighting force. Disease was killing as many as combat. The hospitals were overwhelmed. Civilians were dying of starvation. Children's bodies were piling up in the streets because there weren't enough people with strength to bury them. Starhemberg sent desperate messages to Emperor Leopold. Vienna cannot hold much longer. We need relief now. Leopold, operating from Passau, had been frantically trying to assemble a coalition. Here's where the politics get interesting. The Holy Roman Empire was not a unified state. It was a collection of semi-independent states whose rulers had their own interests and their own armies. Getting them to cooperate required diplomacy, bribes, and appeals to religious unity. Leopold's key breakthrough came from Poland. King Jan III Sobieski, 54 years old, was one of Europe's most experienced military commanders. He'd fought the Ottomans before. He'd won victories against them. And critically, he understood that if Vienna fell, Poland would be next. Sobieski agreed to come, but he extracted concessions. His price for saving Vienna included Leopold's agreement that Polish forces would be paid, supplied, and given a commanding role in the relief effort. The coalition that assembled included Polish forces under Sobieski, approximately 23,000 men, including 3,000 heavy cavalry, the famous Winged Hussars; Imperial Austrian forces under Duke Charles of Lorraine, about 20,000; Saxon troops, around 9,000; Bavarian forces, 11,000; and smaller contingents from Franconia, Swabia, and other German states. Total, roughly 70,000 to 84,000 men, depending on which source you trust. Getting this army to Vienna was a logistical nightmare. Different contingents marched from different directions. They had to coordinate timing, they had to secure supply lines, and they had to do all of this while knowing that the Ottomans could defeat them if they arrived piecemeal. The plan was to concentrate forces at Tollen, northwest of Vienna, then march together to Kallenberg Mountain, which overlooked the city from the north. Inside Vienna, defenders watched the horizon. They had no reliable communication with the relief force. They didn't know if help was actually coming. Starhemberg could only keep his men fighting and hope. On September 6, Ottoman scouts reported movement northwest of the city. A large army was approaching. Kara Mustafa faced a critical decision. Should he maintain the siege and prepare to fight a relief force with his back to the walls, or should he withdraw, regroup, and choose more favorable ground for a battle? He chose to stay. This decision would doom him. Let's pause the tactical narrative and talk about what actually happens to human beings during a 60-day siege. For the civilians trapped in Vienna, estimates suggest 60,000 to 70,000 people. The siege was indiscriminate hell. Starvation doesn't care about your social class. Dysentery kills rich and poor alike. Contemporary accounts describe families eating leather, boiling grass, consuming anything with calories. Children died first because their bodies couldn't sustain prolonged malnutrition, elderly next, then the sick, then anyone wounded who couldn't get adequate medical care. The psychological toll was arguably worse than the physical. Imagine you're in your home. You hear explosions day and night as mines detonate. You don't know if the next blast will collapse your building. You watch your neighbors get killed by artillery fire that comes from Turkish guns positioned just hundreds of meters away. You see soldiers returning from the walls covered in blood, sometimes their own, sometimes the enemy's. You know that if the city falls, you will be raped or enslaved, that your children will be taken, that everything you own will be stolen. And you have no idea if help is coming. Fear becomes the permanent state. Not acute terror, that's exhausting and can't be sustained for 2 months. Instead, a grinding, numbing fear that poisons every moment. Parents make plans for mercy killings of their children if the walls are finally breached. Wives ask husbands to kill them before Ottoman soldiers can reach them. These aren't irrational decisions in the context of 17th century warfare. They're strategic choices based on accurate assessment of what happens to populations in sacked cities. For the soldiers defending the walls, the grind was different but equally brutal. Constant watch rotations, sleep deprivation, the knowledge that every day men next to you die from sniper fire, mines, artillery, or in desperate close-quarters combat in breached sections. The wounded often died not from their injuries, but from infection in filthy field hospitals. Amputation was common. Anesthesia was alcohol. Here's a detail that contemporary sources mention. The smell, 60,000 plus people trapped in a city with deteriorating sanitation, thousands of horse carcasses slaughtered for food, bodies that couldn't be properly buried, primitive medical facilities, the city reeked. Soldiers reported that the stench of death was constant. You couldn't escape it. It was in your clothes, your hair, your equipment. For the Ottoman besiegers, conditions were different but not pleasant. Sieges are boring. You spend most of your time waiting, digging trenches, standing guard. Combat comes in brief, intense bursts, usually when assaulting a breach or defending against a sally from the garrison. The rest is tedium, and in that tedium, disease spreads. Ottoman camps outside Vienna suffered from dysentery, typhus, and other illnesses that killed thousands of soldiers who never saw combat. The Christian slaves, thousands of them held in the Ottoman camp, had it worst. They'd been captured in previous campaigns in Hungary, Croatia, the Balkans. They were kept chained, used as labor, subjected to whatever abuse their captors inflicted. When the battle finally came and the Ottoman army broke, most of these slaves died in the chaos. Some were killed by retreating Ottomans who didn't want them freed. Others were trampled in the panic. A few were killed by Christian soldiers who couldn't distinguish them from the enemy in the confusion. This is what siege warfare actually is, not heroic. Just grinding, efficient human suffering administered by both sides with the tools available in the 17th century. September 11, 1683, the relief force reached Kallenberg Mountain. Sobieski and the other commanders could look down and see the entire siege laid out below them, Vienna surrounded, Ottoman siege lines stretching in a vast arc, tens of thousands of tents, artillery positions, the massive baggage train. Here's the Ottoman problem. Kara Mustafa had positioned his army for a siege, not a field battle. His trenches and earthworks faced Vienna. His artillery was aimed at the walls. His supply dumps and baggage train were in the rear of his position, closest to the mountain. When the relief force arrived on Kallenberg, they were essentially behind the Ottoman lines. Kara Mustafa did take defensive measures. He positioned forces, estimates vary, but probably 20,000 to 30,000 troops on the lower slopes of Kallenberg to block the relief force's descent. He had time to prepare better defenses, but he was caught between competing priorities: maintain pressure on Vienna, which was on the verge of collapse, or fully commit to fighting the relief army. He tried to do both. This is understandable but proved fatal. On September 12, at approximately 4 a.m., the relief force began its descent. The battle developed in phases. Phase 1, infantry advance, 4 a.m., night 12 p.m. The Imperial and German infantry moved down the mountain slopes, engaging Ottoman forces positioned to block them. This was brutal, close-quarters combat in wooded, hilly terrain. The Ottomans fought well. They'd positioned sharpshooters, had artillery support where the ground allowed, and conducted several effective counterattacks. The Christian advance was slow, casualties mounted. By noon, the infantry had fought its way down to more open ground, but the Ottoman lines hadn't broken. Phase 2, artillery and maneuvering, 12 p.m., 5 p.m. As Christian forces reached flatter terrain, they brought up artillery. The battle became a grinding infantry and artillery duel. Ottoman positions were strong. They had numerical parity in this phase. The Christian advance stalled. This is when Sobieski made his crucial decision. Phase 3, the cavalry charge 5 p.m., -7 p.m., Sobieski had held his cavalry in reserve. All day, while infantry fought and died, 18,000 horsemen waited. This wasn't cowardice. This was tactical patience. Cavalry is most effective when it can maneuver freely and hit a vulnerable target. In forests and hills, cavalry is useless. Sobieski waited for the battle to develop onto open ground and for the Ottoman forces to be fully committed. By 5 p.m., conditions were right. The Ottoman army was engaged with Christian infantry. Their attention was forward. Their formations were designed for siege warfare, not cavalry defense. And critically, much of the Ottoman heavy cavalry, the Sipahi, had been sent forward hours earlier and had exhausted themselves in repeated charges. Sobieski formed his cavalry into 4 massive wings. On the right, 3,000 Polish Winged Hussars, the most feared heavy cavalry in Europe, wearing distinctive feathered wings on their backs. These weren't decorative. The wings created a psychological effect, a whooshing sound when the horses galloped that was reportedly audible from hundreds of meters. In the center and left, German, Austrian, and Polish cavalry in mixed formations totaling approximately 15,000. At approximately 6 p.m., Sobieski gave the order, attack. The charge began at a trot. The horses needed to preserve energy. The ground was rough. But as the formation cleared obstacles and hit more open terrain, the pace increased. Trot became canter. Canter became gallop. 18,000 horses, each weighing 450 to 550 kilograms, carrying armored riders with lances, moving at 35 to 40 kilometers per hour. The impact was catastrophic for the Ottomans. Here's why cavalry charges work when they do. Momentum. The kinetic energy of a charging horse is enormous. A lance impact at full gallop can punch through armor. More importantly, the psychological effect is overwhelming. Humans are not evolved to stand still while a wall of horses thunders toward them. Training can overcome this instinct, but it requires perfect discipline and formation integrity. The Ottoman forces, already engaged with infantry to their front, suddenly facing cavalry from their flank and rear, broke, not immediately. Some units held. Ottoman soldiers were professional, experienced troops. But once the first formations shattered, panic spread. The Janissaries, elite Ottoman infantry, attempted to form defensive squares, but the cavalry charge had created chaos. Units couldn't coordinate, officers couldn't communicate. And when soldiers looked behind them and saw their baggage train, loaded with 2 months of plunder, being overrun by enemy cavalry, many broke ranks and ran to protect their loot. This is the moment Kara Mustafa lost the battle. Once the line broke, the entire Ottoman position collapsed. The cavalry charge had lasted approximately 30 minutes of sustained combat, but it triggered a general rout that would continue into the night. The final casualty count, approximately 8,000 to 15,000 Ottoman soldiers killed in the battle itself, with another 5,000 to 10,000 captured. The Christian forces lost approximately 3,500 to 4,000 killed and wounded in the day's fighting. Vienna's garrison, hearing the battle and seeing Ottoman forces withdrawing, sallied out and joined the assault, adding to the chaos. Kara Mustafa escaped. He fled the battlefield with a contingent of guards and rode toward Belgrade, leaving behind his army, his baggage train, and his reputation. Night fell over Vienna on September 12th. The Ottoman camp was in flames. Christian soldiers moved through the sprawling tent city, encountering scenes of desperate last stands and mass surrender. The baggage train, hundreds of wagons, thousands of carts held unimaginable wealth. Silk carpets, gold plate, jeweled weapons, silver coins, spices, coffee, exotic animals. One legend holds that this was Europe's first encounter with coffee beans captured from Turkish supplies, though this is disputed by historians. More importantly, the camp held war materials, hundreds of cannons, thousands of muskets, gunpowder magazines, siege equipment, all of it now in Christian hands, and the camp held prisoners. chained men, women and children. Christians captured in previous campaigns who'd been enslaved by Ottoman forces. Sources differ on exactly what happened to them in the chaos. Some were freed and survived, many did not. The breakdown of military discipline, the darkness, the ongoing combat with Ottoman rear guards, it was a nightmare. By September 13th, the immediate area around Vienna was secured. Ottoman forces were in full retreat eastward. Sobieski reportedly sent a letter to Pope Innocent XI paraphrasing Julius Caesar, "Venimus, vidimus Deus visit, we came, we saw, God conquered." This became one of history's famous victory messages, but victories have costs. The Christian relief force had suffered approximately 3,500 to 4,000 casualties in the battle. Vienna's garrison had lost at least 4,000 dead during the siege, possibly more. Civilian deaths inside the city likely numbered in the thousands from starvation, disease, and artillery bombardment. The exact figures will never be known. The Ottomans suffered catastrophic losses. Beyond the 15,000 to 20,000 dead in the final battle and the thousands killed during the 2-month siege, the army lost its equipment, supplies, and cohesion. The retreat became a rout. Hungarian rebels who'd allied with the Ottomans switched sides when they saw the outcome. Austrian and Polish forces pursued the broken Ottoman army for weeks, killing stragglers, destroying rear guards. But the most dramatic consequence came 3 months later. On December 25, 1683, Christmas Day, in Belgrade, executioners strangled Kara Mustafa Pasha with a silk cord. This was Ottoman tradition for high-ranking officials, execution by strangulation considered more honorable than beheading. Sultan Mehmed IV had ordered it. Kara Mustafa's last words were reportedly, "Am I to die?" And as God pleases, his execution wasn't just about military failure, it was political necessity. The Vienna disaster had cost the empire prestige, treasure and territory. Someone had to pay. Kara Mustafa, who'd led the army and made the crucial tactical errors, particularly the decision to continue the siege while a relief force approached, became the scapegoat. His head was sent to the Sultan, his property was confiscated, his family was disgraced. Within Ottoman political culture, this was predictable. Grand viziers served at the Sultan's pleasure and died at his command. Failure meant death. The Battle of Vienna's immediate military consequences were clear. The Ottoman advance into Europe was stopped. But the strategic consequences took years to unfold and were more complex than the simple narrative of Christianity defeated Islam. First, the military balance shifted. The Ottoman defeat triggered what became known as the Great Turkish War, 1683 to 1699, in which the Holy Roman Empire, Poland, Venice, and Russia formed a coalition that systematically pushed Ottoman forces out of Hungary, Transylvania, Croatia, and parts of the Balkans. Cities and territories that had been under Ottoman control for a century were reconquered. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 formalized these losses. The Ottoman Empire didn't collapse. It would survive another 220 years, but it never again seriously threatened Central Europe. Second, the political landscape of Europe changed. Emperor Leopold I emerged strengthened. The coalition that had saved Vienna became the basis for Habsburg dominance in Central Europe. Poland, despite Sobieski's crucial role, gained less than it hoped. Sobieski died in 1696, and Poland entered a period of decline that would culminate in its partition a century later. The great irony: the king who saved Vienna led a nation that couldn't save itself. Third, the cultural impact was enormous. The siege and relief of Vienna became legend. Coffee houses, supposedly using beans captured from the Ottoman camp, spread across Europe. Croissants, crescent-shaped pastries supposedly created to mock the Ottoman crescent, became ubiquitous, though historians debate this origin story. More seriously, the victory reinforced European Christian identity against the Turkish threat, a narrative that would persist for centuries. For Vienna itself, the recovery was long and painful. Rebuilding the damaged fortifications took years. The population recovered slowly. Trauma doesn't heal quickly, but within a generation, Vienna would become one of Europe's great capitals, its Baroque architecture and musical culture flourishing in what many call its golden age. The city that nearly died became the jewel of the Habsburg Empire. The Ottoman Empire, meanwhile, entered what historians call its period of stagnation and reform. The loss at Vienna exposed military and administrative weaknesses. Subsequent defeats accelerated the process. The empire would survive by adapting, modernizing its military, reforming its bureaucracy, and playing European powers against each other. But the era of expansion was over. One number puts this in perspective. In 1683, the Ottoman Empire controlled approximately 5.2 million square kilometers of territory. By 1800, it had lost about 20% of that. By 1914, when World War I began, the empire was called the Sick Man of Europe and controlled a fraction of its 1683 extent. The trajectory began at Vienna. What does the Siege of Vienna teach us about how wars are won and lost? First, logistics matter more than heroism. Sobieski's cavalry charge was spectacular, but it succeeded because the Ottoman army was positioned wrong, supplied inadequately for a prolonged campaign, and caught between competing objectives. Kara Mustafa's fundamental error wasn't tactical, it was strategic. He committed to besieging a city he couldn't quickly capture while knowing a relief force was assembling. Once that relief force arrived, his army was in an indefensible position. Second, coalition warfare is messy but effective. The Christian relief force was cobbled together from multiple states with competing interests. They bickered over command, pay, and credit for the victory. But they cooperated enough to win. The Ottoman Empire, by contrast, couldn't effectively coordinate with its Hungarian allies and failed to secure adequate support from its vassals. Divided armies lose to united ones, even when the divided army is individually stronger. Third, sieges are won by whoever can sustain them longer. Vienna held for 60 days because Starhemberg rationed supplies, maintained discipline, and convinced his garrison that surrender meant death. The Ottomans failed because they couldn't break the walls quickly enough and because their supply lines became vulnerable once a relief force approached. In any siege, time favors whoever has better logistics. Fourth, cavalry remains relevant when used correctly. This battle is often cited as one of the last great cavalry victories in European warfare. Within decades, improved firearms and artillery would make massive cavalry charges suicidal. But in 1683, on terrain that allowed maneuver, against an enemy positioned for siege warfare, cavalry delivered decisive shock action. The Winged Hussars didn't save Vienna through magic, they saved it through the physics of momentum applied at the right moment. Fifth, political consequences often matter more than military outcomes. Vienna was militarily important, yes, but the political and psychological impact was what changed history. The Ottoman Empire's aura of invincibility was broken. European states gained confidence to push back. The shift in momentum led to territorial gains that redrew the map of southeastern Europe. But here's the uncomfortable question. Was this a Christian victory over Islam? Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that the belligerents identified religiously, and that religious rhetoric motivated soldiers on both sides. The Pope backed the relief force. Islamic scholars endorsed the siege. Religion was central to how contemporaries understood the war. No, in the sense that this wasn't a war about theology. It was about territorial control, political power, and imperial expansion. The Ottoman Empire wasn't conquering Europe to spread Islam. It was conquering to gain wealth, land, and subjects. The Holy Roman Empire wasn't defending Vienna to protect Christian doctrine. It was defending a strategic capital to preserve Habsburg power. Religion was the language of the war, but the grammar was politics. And both sides committed acts that violated their own religious teachings. Ottoman forces enslaved Christians despite Quranic restrictions on slavery. Christian forces massacred prisoners despite Jesus' teachings on mercy. War makes hypocrites of everyone. September 12, 1683 was a hinge date. Before that day, the Ottoman Empire was expanding. After, it was contracting. Before that day, Europe was divided and defensive. After, it was confederated and aggressive. Before that day, Vienna faced annihilation. After, it became a symbol of Christian resilience. But victory doesn't validate the victors morally, and defeat doesn't condemn the defeated. The Ottomans built one of history's great civilizations, remarkable architecture, sophisticated law, advanced administration, cultural achievements in poetry, calligraphy, and music. That civilization's forward momentum ended at Vienna, but its legacy persists. The Christians who won at Vienna would spend the next 2 centuries conquering much of the world through colonialism that inflicted suffering dwarfing anything the Ottomans inflicted in their conquests. History isn't a morality play, it's a record of what humans do when organized into competing power structures. Sometimes the better tactical commander wins, sometimes logistics decides. Sometimes one side gets lucky. At Vienna, the Christians got lucky that Kara Mustafa made poor strategic choices. The Ottomans got unlucky that Sobieski was one of history's most capable cavalry commanders. Skill, error, chance, all three decided the outcome. So here's the question worth pondering. If Vienna had fallen on September 12th, if those mines had breached the walls 1 week earlier before the relief force arrived, how would history remember the siege? Would Ottoman historians celebrate it as a great triumph of Islamic civilization? Would European historians lament it as the end of Christendom? Would the trajectory of the next 3 centuries have been fundamentally different? We'll never know. We only know what happened. On that day, 18,000 cavalry charged down a mountain, an empire's advance stopped, and the balance of power shifted. Whether that made the world better or just different is a question every generation has to answer for themselves.